Hello and welcome to History at Night. Deep in the rainforests of Central America, beneath a thick green canopy of leaves, there are cities of stone. Magnificent pyramids rise above the jungle floor, their ancient steps worn smooth by centuries of rain. Grand plazas, once filled with the voices of thousands, now echo only with the calls of howler monkeys. Temples that once gleamed white in the tropical sun are now shrouded in moss and twisted roots. For hundreds of years, these cities slept, forgotten by the world, known only to the local people who lived in their shadow and wondered at the ghosts of their ancestors. This is the world of the Maya, one of the most brilliant civilizations ever to rise in the ancient Americas. They built soaring pyramids without metal tools or the wheel. They created the only complete writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas. They developed a calendar so accurate it rivals our own. And they charted the movements of the planets with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for 1,000 years. At their height, millions of people lived in their great cities, bound together by trade, religion, and the sacred rule of divine kings. And then, mysteriously, many of these cities were abandoned. The people melted back into the jungle, and the forest slowly reclaimed what they had built. For centuries, the world forgot they had ever existed. Tonight, we will journey deep into the jungle to discover these lost cities and the people who built them. We will walk through the ruins of Tikal and Palenque, cities that once rivaled any in the ancient world. We will learn how the Maya turned the challenging rainforest into a thriving homeland. We will explore their strange and beautiful beliefs, their complex writing, and their obsession with time and the stars. And we will investigate one of history's greatest mysteries. Why did they abandon their magnificent cities? What happened to the Maya? But before we begin our expedition into the green heart of the jungle, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back in time and deep into the rainforest, to the world of the Maya, to the cities hidden in the jungle. The story of the rediscovery of the Maya cities begins not with archaeologists or scholars, but with rumors. For centuries after the Spanish conquest of the Americas, strange stories filtered out of the dense jungles of Central America. Indigenous people spoke of vast ruins hidden in the forest, of stone palaces swallowed by trees, of pyramids as tall as mountains covered in mysterious carvings. But these stories were largely dismissed by the outside world. The Europeans could not imagine that the native peoples of the Americas had built anything so grand. If these ruins existed at all, they must surely be the work of some lost tribe of Europeans, or perhaps the Egyptians, or even the lost tribes of Israel. Anything, it seemed, except the ancestors of the people who still lived there. In the year 1839, two men set out to find the truth. One was John Lloyd Stevens, an American lawyer and diplomat with an insatiable curiosity and a gift for vivid writing. The other was Frederick Catherwood, a British architect and artist with a remarkable talent for detailed illustration. Together, they embarked on a journey into the wild, unmapped jungles of what is now Honduras and Guatemala. The expedition was grueling. They traveled by mule through dense, suffocating rainforest, drenched by constant rain, tormented by swarms of biting insects, and plagued by tropical diseases. The region was in the midst of a chaotic civil war, and they had to negotiate with suspicious local warlords just to pass through safely. But they pressed on, following the whispered directions of their local guides. And then, after weeks of struggle, hacking their way through the thick undergrowth with machetes. They emerged into a clearing near the Copán River. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Rising from the jungle floor were magnificent stone monuments, steely, carved from top to bottom with intricate images and mysterious symbols. These were not crude works of primitive people. They were sophisticated sculptures, as refined and complex as anything produced in ancient Greece or Rome. Catherwood, the architect, stood in stunned silence, recognizing immediately that these monuments were the work of an advanced and highly skilled civilization. As they explored further, pushing deeper into the ruins, they found vast plazas paved with stone, the remains of towering pyramids and elegant palaces whose walls still bore traces of ancient plaster and paint. It was clear that this had once been a great city, home to thousands of people, and it was equally clear that it had been abandoned for centuries, slowly consumed by the relentless growth of the jungle. Stevens, ever the practical American, was so convinced of the importance of what they had found that he negotiated to purchase the entire ruined city from its bemused local owner for the sum of $50. For months, Catherwood worked in the sweltering heat, his hands swollen from insect bites, using his architectural training and a device called a camera lucida to create precise drawings of the monuments and buildings. These were not romantic, imaginary reconstructions. They were careful, accurate records of what he saw. Meanwhile, Stevens took detailed notes, describing everything they encountered with the eye of a trained observer and the pen of a natural storyteller. Their journey continued. They discovered more lost cities, each one a revelation. At Palenque in Mexico, they found an elegant, multi-storied palace perched on a hillside, its walls decorated with delicate stucco reliefs. At Tikal in Guatemala, they gazed up at the tallest pyramids they had yet seen, stone mountains rising from the endless green ocean of the forest canopy. When Stevens returned to the United States and published his account, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, filled with Catherwood's stunning illustrations, it became an immediate sensation. The book proved, beyond any doubt, that a great and sophisticated civilization had indeed flourished in Central America. These cities were not built by Egyptians or wandering Europeans. They were the creation of the indigenous people of the Americas, the ancestors of the Maya who still lived in the region. The lost cities of the jungle had been found, but their discovery opened more questions than it answered. Who were the people who built these magnificent cities? How did they live? What did their mysterious carvings mean? And perhaps, most intriguing of all, why had they abandoned their cities and allowed the jungle to swallow them whole? The silent stones offered no easy answers. To understand the Maya, we must first understand the world they inhabited. The Maya homeland is a challenging and diverse landscape, stretching from the mountains of southern Mexico through Guatemala and Belize to the lowland jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula. It is a land of extremes. In the highlands, volcanic peaks rise above the clouds, their slopes covered in pine forests. In the lowlands, the climate is tropical and hot, with dense rainforest that receives torrential rains for half the year and suffers through a harsh dry season for the other half. The soil in the lowlands is thin and easily exhausted. There are few rivers, and in the northern Yucatan, there are no rivers at all. Water comes from rainfall and from natural sinkholes called cenotes, where the limestone bedrock has collapsed to reveal underground pools. This was not an easy place to build a civilization. And yet, the Maya not only survived here, they thrived. At the height of their power, during what archaeologists call the Classic period. From roughly 250 to 900 AD, millions of people lived in the Maya world. Their great cities were not isolated outposts. They were thriving urban centers, each one the capital of its own independent kingdom, bound together by a complex web of trade, alliance, and rivalry. The foundation of all Maya life, the crop that made everything possible, was maize or corn. The Maya were the people of the corn. It was their primary food, ground into flour and made into flat cakes called tortillas, mixed into a nourishing drink and fermented into a mildly alcoholic beverage. Corn was not just sustenance, it was sacred. According to Maya belief, the gods had created humanity itself from corn dough, forming the first people from the same substance that fed them. Growing corn in the challenging environment of the rainforest required ingenuity and constant effort. In the lowlands, farmers used a technique called slash-and-burn agriculture. They would cut down a section of forest, let the wood dry during the dry season, and then burn it. The ash enriched the thin soil, and for a few years, the cleared plot would produce good harvests of corn, beans, and squash. But the soil would quickly become exhausted, and the farmer would have to move on to clear a new section of forest, allowing the old plot to regenerate. In some areas, the Maya built more sophisticated agricultural systems. They terraced the hillsides to prevent soil erosion and create level planting surfaces. In the low-lying swamps, they constructed raised fields, mounds of earth surrounded by canals that provided water, transportation, and a rich source of mud to fertilize the crops. These intensive farming techniques allowed the Maya to support large, dense populations in cities that could house tens of thousands of people. But the Maya world was not a single, unified empire. It was a patchwork of rival city-states, each fiercely independent, each ruled by its own royal dynasty. Great cities like Tikal, Palenque, Copán, and Calakmul were powers in their own right, controlling surrounding territories and competing for dominance. The kings of these cities were not mere political rulers. They were considered divine intermediaries between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. The Maya called them Kawal, Ajor, the divine lord. The king's most important duty was not to make war or pass laws. It was to perform the sacred rituals that maintained the order of the cosmos, that ensured the sun would rise each day, the rains would come in season, and the corn would grow. And the most powerful of these rituals involved the king's own blood. In elaborate ceremonies performed atop the great pyramids before the assembled crowds of the city, the Maya king would use a sharp blade of obsidian, a stingray spine, or a sharpened bone to pierce his own flesh. He would draw blood from his tongue, his earlobes, or other parts of his body, allowing the sacred liquid to drip onto strips of bark paper placed in a special bowl. The paper would then be burned, and in the rising smoke, it was believed that a portal would open, a shimmering doorway between the world of the living and the world of the gods and ancestors. Through this portal, the king could communicate with the divine powers, petitioning them for the continued prosperity of his people. This was the great covenant at the heart of Maya civilization. The people fed the king with tribute from their fields. The king, in turn, fed the gods with his own sacred blood. As long as this cycle continued, the universe would remain in balance and the kingdom would flourish. The cities themselves were designed as sacred landscapes, physical representations of the Maya cosmos. At the center of each city was the Great Plaza, a vast open space paved with white limestone plaster that gleamed brilliantly in the sun. Surrounding the plaza were the temples and palaces, massive stone structures built atop stepped pyramids. These pyramids were not tombs, as in Egypt. They were artificial mountains, platforms that raised the temples closer to the sky and the realm of the gods. The temples at their summits were relatively small, intimate spaces where the king and the priests would perform their sacred rituals. But the pyramids themselves were immense, some rising more than 200 feet above the plaza below, dominating the landscape for miles around. The largest of all was Temple 4 at Tikal, which still stands as one of the tallest pre-Columbian structures in the Americas. The palaces where the royal family lived were equally impressive. Multi-story buildings with dozens of rooms arranged around interior courtyards. The rooms were narrow, with corbelled arches, a distinctive Maya architectural feature, where each layer of stone projects slightly inward until the gap at the top is narrow enough to be closed with a single capstone. The walls of these palaces were covered with smooth plaster and often decorated with elaborate paintings or carved reliefs, depicting the king in ceremonial regalia, historical events, or scenes from Maya mythology. Beyond the central ceremonial core, the city sprawled outward in a vast network of residential areas, workshops, and smaller temples. The population was dense. At its height, Tikal may have been home to more than 60,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. What is perhaps most remarkable about Maya cities is what they lacked. There were no defensive walls, no fortifications. Unlike the castles and fortress cities of medieval Europe or the great walled cities of China, the Maya built their urban centers open and exposed. This was not because they lived in peace. Far from it. Maya warfare was constant and brutal, but their cities were designed primarily as ceremonial centers, sacred spaces dedicated to the gods and the divine king. The population, rather than huddling behind protective walls, spread out across the landscape, connected to the city center by a network of white limestone roads called sakbib, or white ways. These raised causeways, sometimes stretching for miles through the jungle, linked the various parts of the city and connected neighboring settlements, creating a web of communication and trade. The Maya were master builders, but they achieved their architectural wonders without some of the tools we consider essential. They had no metal tools. Everything was carved, shaped, and built using stone hammers, chisels, and axes. They had no wheeled vehicles and no beasts of burden. Every massive stone block used to build the pyramids and temples was quarried, shaped, and moved into place by human muscle power alone, using log rollers, ropes, and sheer determination. And yet, they created structures that have endured for more than 1,000 years, buildings whose precision and artistry continue to amaze modern architects. The Maya were not just builders, they were artists of extraordinary skill. The stone monuments that so stunned Stevens and Catherwood, the stelae, are perhaps their most distinctive artistic creation. These tall, flat slabs of stone, some more than 10 feet high, were erected in the plazas of Maya cities to commemorate important events and to glorify the kings. Each stela was intricately carved with the portrait of a king, dressed in elaborate ceremonial regalia, wearing a massive feathered headdress, holding a ceremonial staff or weapon, his face bearing the sharp aristocratic features the Maya considered beautiful. Surrounding the portrait were panels of glyphs, the mysterious symbols that recorded the king's name, his lineage, his great deeds, and the date of the monument's dedication. These monuments were not carved at random. They were part of a grand historical project, a permanent record of the city's history written in stone. The Maya were obsessed with history and with the passage of time. They believed that understanding the cycles of time was the key to predicting the future and maintaining cosmic order. And so they kept meticulous records, carving the dates and deeds of their kings for all eternity. To a modern viewer, the glyphs that cover these monuments might seem like decorative designs or abstract symbols, but they are neither. They are writing, a true written language, as sophisticated as any in the ancient world. For more than a century after their rediscovery, these glyphs remained a profound mystery. Scholars could recognize that they were some form of writing, but they could not read them. The language the Maya spoke was extinct, or so it was believed. The key to their script was lost. The breakthrough came slowly, beginning in the 1950s and accelerating in the following decades. A Russian linguist named Yuri Norizov, working in isolation behind the Iron Curtain, made a revolutionary proposal. He argued that the glyphs were not purely symbolic pictures, but a mixed system that combined logograms, symbols representing whole words, with phonetic signs representing syllables. His work was initially dismissed by Western scholars, but it proved to be correct. Around the same time, a brilliant architect and artist named Tatyana Proskuryakov, studying the patterns of dates on the stelae, made a crucial discovery. She noticed that, on monuments from a single city, the dates fell into clusters that matched a human lifespan. An early date, she realized, must mark the birth of a king. A slightly later date marked his accession to the throne, and a final date recorded his death. The monuments were not mystical religious texts. They were historical biographies, recording the lives and deeds of real people. These two breakthroughs opened the floodgates. Working collaboratively, a new generation of scholars began to decipher the Maya script, symbol by symbol, word by word. It was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, and as the glyphs were finally read, the silent stones began to speak. They told stories of great kings and queens, of wars and alliances, of triumphs and disasters. They revealed a world far more complex, more violent, and more human than anyone had imagined. The Maya were not the peaceful stargazers and philosophers that early scholars had believed them to be. They were ambitious, competitive, and warlike. Their kings fought brutal wars against rival cities, capturing enemy rulers to sacrifice them in public spectacles. The carved monuments recorded these victories with pride, showing kings trampling their defeated enemies or presenting bound captives for judgment. But perhaps the Maya's greatest intellectual achievement was not their architecture or their art, but their mathematics and their understanding of time. The Maya developed a sophisticated number system based not on tens, like ours, but on 20s. This vigesimal system was elegant and efficient. A single dot represented 1, a horizontal bar represented 5, and most remarkably, they independently invented the concept of 0, representing it with a special glyph shaped like a shell. The invention of 0 was a profound mathematical breakthrough that many great civilizations, including the Romans, never achieved. With this number system, the Maya could perform complex calculations, tracking vast periods of time with perfect accuracy. Time, for the Maya, was sacred. They did not have one calendar, but several, complex interlocking systems that governed every aspect of their lives. The first was the Tizocan, a sacred calendar of 260 days used for divination and religious ceremonies. The second was the Hob, a solar calendar of 365 days that tracked the agricultural seasons. These two calendars worked together like gears in a machine, creating a larger cycle of 52 years. But to record history across even longer spans, the Maya created the long count, a linear calendar that counted the number of days since a mythical creation date, which corresponds to August 11th, 3114 BC in our calendar. It is this long count, carved on their monuments with precise mathematical notation, that allows archaeologists today to date Maya history with astonishing accuracy, down to the exact day. The Mayas' mastery of mathematics was driven by their obsession with astronomy. From observatories built atop their pyramids, Maya priest astronomers spent night after night tracking the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets across the sky. They recorded their observations with meticulous care, creating astronomical tables of remarkable accuracy. They could predict solar and lunar eclipses, events they saw as moments of great cosmic significance and potential danger. They paid particular attention to the planet Venus, which they associated with warfare and sacrifice. They knew that Venus's cycle of appearances as morning star and evening star repeated every 584 days, and they timed important military campaigns to coincide with its appearances. Their astronomical knowledge was so advanced that their calculations of the lunar month and the solar year were more accurate than those used in Europe until the adoption of the Gregorian calendar in 1582. The Maya had achieved this precision more than 1,000 years earlier, without telescopes or any of the instruments of modern science. Using only their eyes, their mathematics, and their patient observation of the heavens. At the height of their power, around the year 750 AD, the Maya world must have seemed eternal. The great cities of the southern lowlands were thriving. Tikal, with its soaring pyramids, was a bustling metropolis. The kings of Kalakmar, the mighty Serpent Kingdom, controlled a vast network of vassal cities. At Copán, artisans were carving some of the most beautiful and complex monuments in the ancient Americas. The population was at its peak, the traditions were strong, and the kings continued to perform their sacred rituals, ensuring the cosmic order. But this was the summit before a long and mysterious fall, and the first sign that something was going wrong is written in stone, or rather, in the sudden absence of stone monuments. For centuries, Maya kings had obsessively erected dated monuments to commemorate their reigns and their great deeds. Thanks to the long count calendar carved on these stelae, we can track the history of the Maya cities with precision. And it is this very precision that reveals the unraveling. Starting in the late 8th century, one by one, the great cities of the southern lowlands began to fall silent. At Palenque, the last dated monument was carved in 799 AD at Copán. The last stela was erected in 822 AD at the superpower city of Tikal. The final monument bears the date 869 AD after these dates. The tradition that had defined Maya civilization for centuries simply stops. The kings were no longer commissioning these public declarations of their power and their divine mandate. This silence in the archaeological record is chilling. It tells us that something was going profoundly wrong. Further evidence comes from the ruins themselves. Archaeologists have found massive construction projects, new temples, palace expansions, grand causeways that were left mysteriously unfinished. Plazas were only half paved. Intricately carved stones were abandoned along the roads, as if the workers had simply put down their tools and walked away. At some sites, we see evidence of hastily built fortifications, crude defensive walls thrown up around the palaces and temples, a stark departure from the open, confident architecture of earlier centuries. This was a world that had suddenly begun to live in fear. The quality of goods also declined. The fine painted pottery, the exquisite jade carvings, the sophisticated trade goods that had circulated through the Maya world began to disappear. The networks were breaking down. The master craftsmen were disappearing. Over a period of roughly a century and a half, from about 750 to 900 AD, the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands emptied out. This was not a sudden catastrophe, it was a slow, agonizing collapse. The cities were not, for the most part, conquered and burned by foreign invaders. They simply lost their populations. The people who had sustained these magnificent urban centers for generations made a collective, desperate choice. They left. This was the great abandonment. Families who had lived for generations in the shadow of the pyramids, farming the surrounding land and paying tribute to the divine kings, gathered their few possessions and walked away into the jungle. The ceremonial centers, the great plazas and temples, were the first to be abandoned. For a time, it appears that some commoners moved into the empty palaces, building crude cooking fires on the fine plaster floors, squatters in the houses of their former gods and kings. But eventually, they too departed. And then, the jungle began its slow, patient work of reclamation. Seeds carried by the wind took root in the cracks of the plazas. Plants grew, their roots breaking apart the carefully laid limestone. The great ceiba and ramon trees, their powerful roots like massive fingers, began to undermine the foundations of the pyramids, splitting the stone stairs and toppling the carved monuments. Over the centuries, a thick blanket of vegetation covered everything. The pyramids, once visible for miles, became indistinguishable from natural hills. The plazas became clearings on the jungle floor. The cities fell silent, their only sounds the calls of the howler monkeys and the rustle of leaves. For nearly 1,000 years, the great centers of Maya civilization would remain in this state. Hidden from the world, their history forgotten, waiting for explorers to stumble upon them and wonder at their silent grandeur. So what happened? Why did the Maya abandon their cities? This is one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, and for more than a century, scholars have debated the answer. The truth, as modern science has revealed, is that there was no single cause. The Maya collapse was not a simple story with one villain. It was a perfect storm, a series of interconnected crises that fed upon each other, creating a cascade of failure from which the civilization could not recover. Let us examine the evidence, piece by piece, like detectives investigating a crime scene centuries cold. The first clue comes from the monuments and the art. As we decode the glyphs and study the carvings from the final years of the classic period, we see that warfare was intensifying. For centuries, Maya warfare had been a ritualized affair. The goal was to capture rival kings and nobles for sacrifice, not to annihilate entire populations. But in the decades leading up to the collapse, the conflict seems to have changed. The art becomes grimmer. We see depictions of burning cities, of larger battles, of desperate fortifications. At some sites, archaeologists have found mass graves, evidence of violence on a scale not seen before. The most detailed picture of this escalating violence comes from the Petexpotan region of Guatemala, where a dynasty of kings at the city of Dos Pilas embarked on aggressive campaigns of conquest, creating enemies on all sides. For a time, they succeeded, but their aggression triggered a spiral of retaliatory warfare that consumed the entire region. Cities that had coexisted for centuries were suddenly locked in a death struggle. The constant fighting disrupted trade, prevented farmers from tending their fields, and undermined faith in the divine kings who were supposed to maintain order. But warfare alone cannot explain the collapse. The Maya had fought wars for centuries without abandoning their cities. Something else, something more fundamental, was going wrong. The answer lies in the environment. Modern scientific techniques have allowed researchers to reconstruct the ancient climate of the Maya world with remarkable precision. By drilling deep into the beds of lakes and analyzing the layers of sediment, and by studying the chemical composition of stalagmites in caves, scientists can read the history of rainfall year by year, going back thousands of years, and what they have found is striking. The period of the Maya's greatest growth, from roughly 300 to 600 AD, corresponds to a time of unusually high and reliable rainfall. The climate was favorable, the crops flourished, and the population boomed. But beginning around 750 AD, just as the southern cities began to fail, the climate shifted. The region entered a prolonged period of severe drought, punctuated by several multi-decade megadroughts that were unlike anything the Maya had experienced before. The impact would have been catastrophic. The carefully constructed reservoirs that supplied water to cities like Tikal would have dried up. The corn crops, the very foundation of Maya life, would have failed season after season. Famine would have spread across the land. The cenotes, the sacred sinkholes that provided water in the northern Yucatan, would have run low or dried up entirely. For a people who depended on seasonal rains to survive, this prolonged drought was an existential crisis. But the drought, devastating as it was, had been made worse by the Maya themselves. For centuries, the population had been growing, and the cities had been expanding. To feed their people, the Maya had cleared vast areas of forest for farming, to build their magnificent pyramids and palaces. They had cut down thousands of acres of trees to burn limestone and make the white plaster that covered their buildings. This deforestation had a cascading effect. Without the trees to hold the thin tropical soil in place, it eroded away into the rivers and swamps. The loss of the forest meant less moisture in the air, making the natural dry seasons even harsher. The Maya, in their drive to build ever greater cities, had pushed their fragile environment to the breaking point. They had created a civilization that was living on the edge, with no margin for error. And when the climate shifted and the droughts came, there was no resilience left in the system. The perfect storm was complete. Environmental degradation made the cities vulnerable. The drought triggered widespread famine. The famine led to conflict as cities fought over the remaining fertile lands and water sources. The warfare made the famine worse by disrupting farming and trade. And through it all, the divine kings, whose sacred duty was to maintain cosmic order and ensure the rains, were failing. Their blood sacrifices were not working. The gods were not listening. As the droughts dragged on, year after terrible year, and as the wars brought only more death and misery, the people lost faith not just in their individual kings, but in the entire system. The social contract that had held Maya civilization together for centuries dissolved. And so, faced with famine, war, and a failed religious and political system, the people made the only rational choice they could. They left. They abandoned the great stone cities and the divine lords who had failed them. They scattered into the jungle, returning to a simpler way of life in smaller, more sustainable communities where they could survive. The collapse of the southern Maya cities was not the end of the Maya people. It was the end of a particular way of life, the end of the age of divine kings and massive urban centers. The Maya themselves survived. They adapted, they endured, and in the northern part of their homeland, the Yucatan Peninsula, Maya civilization experienced a final flowering. Cities like Chichon, Itza, and Uxmal rose to prominence, building magnificent new monuments in a distinctive style that blended Maya traditions with influences from central Mexico. These northern cities thrived for centuries after the southern collapse. Their power based not on intensive agriculture, but on trade networks that spanned the Caribbean. But even these cities would eventually decline. And when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they found not a great empire, but a patchwork of small Maya kingdoms and towns. The Spanish conquest was brutal and devastating, but it did not destroy the Maya. Today, more than 7 million Maya people live in their ancestral homelands, speaking Maya languages, maintaining traditions that stretch back thousands of years. They are not relics of a lost civilization. They are the living descendants of the people who built the pyramids, the inheritors of a culture that has adapted and endured through centuries of change. The cities in the jungle may be silent, but the Maya people are not. Their story is not one of disappearance, but of resilience. And perhaps that is the most important lesson the Maya have to teach us. Civilizations rise and fall. Great cities can be abandoned, their pyramids swallowed by the jungle. But the people, the culture, the spirit, these can endure. The Maya built their cities in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They achieved heights of art, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy that command our respect even today. And when their cities failed, they survived by adapting, by returning to older, simpler ways of life, by choosing survival over the glory of the past. The ruins that Stevens and Catherwood found, and that continue to draw visitors today, are not tombs. They are monuments to human ingenuity and human ambition. They are also reminders of the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations. The Maya pushed their environment too hard. They became locked in cycles of competition and warfare. And when the climate shifted, they had no cushion to absorb the shock. Their story is a mirror held up to our own time, a warning about the dangers of environmental degradation, the perils of endless growth, and the importance of living within the limits of what our world can sustainably provide. The cities hidden in the jungle have finally revealed their secrets. The glyphs have been read, the dates have been deciphered, the causes of the collapse have been investigated. But the pyramids, rising above the green canopy, still command wonder. They remind us that the Maya were not primitive people living in harmony with nature. They were ambitious, complex, brilliant, and flawed, just as we are. They reached for the heavens, building mountains of stone to bring themselves closer to the gods. And in the end, the jungle reclaimed what they had built. But their story, carved in stone and written in the stars, endures. Thank you for joining me on this journey deep into the jungle, to the world of the Maya. I hope their story has brought the mystery and beauty of the ancient Americas to life. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Yet even as we leave the grand plazas and the towering pyramids behind, the story of the Maya continues to unfold in ways far subtler and more intimate than the stones of their abandoned cities suggest. Because the truth is that no civilization, no matter how radiant, how sophisticated, or how seemingly vanished ever, truly ends. It transforms, it adapts, it shifts shape and survives in quieter, often unexpected corners. And as we let our imagination drift deeper into the humid twilight of the jungle, where fireflies flicker like tiny stars between the trees, it becomes clear that the Maya story is not merely a tale of the past. It is a living thread woven through centuries, connecting ancient kings to modern farmers, sacred rituals to everyday gestures, lost cities to bustling towns, and the quiet breath of the forest to the pulse of human endurance. When we imagine the collapse of a civilization, we often picture chaos, the sudden thunder of downfall, the rapid unraveling of everything familiar. But the truth for the Maya was more nuanced. The cities fell silent, yes, power shifted. The great rituals ceased. Yet the people themselves did not vanish into myth. They carried their traditions with them as they left the monumental cores. They carried their stories, their languages, their ways of weaving and planting and praying. They carried the quiet knowledge of how to live with the land, how to endure hardship, how to rebuild life on smaller scales. And this continuity, invisible to the eyes of early explorers who stared at the empty cities and assumed extinction, is perhaps the most remarkable part of the Maya legacy. For when the Spanish arrived centuries later, they encountered not a forgotten people but communities still guided by many of the same principles that shaped the ancient world. In remote villages, the Maya continued to track time not merely by the Christian calendar imposed upon them, but by the rhythms of the tizocan and the hob. They still watched the sky with the same careful attention their ancestors had used to predict eclipses and mark the cycles of Venus. They still told stories of gods and heroes whose origins stretched back into the deep past. And even when forced to hide their beliefs beneath the surface of imposed religions, they wove their ancient worldview into new forms, blending symbols, rituals, and rhythms in ways that preserve the heart of their identity. To walk through a modern Maya village today is, in quiet ways, to walk through time. The houses may be built of materials newer than stone, and the tools may come from modern stores rather than obsidian quarries, but the way people gather in plazas, the communal celebrations, the reverence for the land, the breathtaking skill of the artisans, all of it echoes the ancient cities. The colors woven into their textiles still mirror the symbolism of the cosmos, the reds of creation, the greens of maize, the blues of the sacred sky. Their languages, spoken softly between generations, preserve words and sounds once carved into stele. Even their stories, whispered beside cooking fires or during long walks along jungle paths, still carry the cadence of myths older than recorded history. It is easy to forget, when looking at grand ruins, that a civilization is not its stones. Stones crumble, cities fall silent, but people endure, culture endures, memory endures. And nowhere is this more true than in the Maya world. The forest too plays a part in this ongoing story. For although the jungle reclaimed the ancient cities, it also protected them. In swallowing the monumental centers, the forest shielded them from destruction by later conquerors, allowed their carvings to sleep undisturbed, preserved their secrets for centuries until archaeologists could uncover them with careful hands. And in doing so, the jungle became not just a destroyer but a guardian. The same dense canopy that hides jaguars and toucans, that hums with insects and glows with bioluminescent life, also shelters the last physical whispers of Maya kings who once raised their blood to the heavens. Imagine standing now on the summit of a Maya pyramid at dawn, the jungle stretching endlessly in all directions. Mist curls through the canopy, softening the outlines of the tallest temples as they emerge like islands from a green sea. In this moment, something profound becomes clear. These structures were never meant to dominate the land. They were meant to rise with it, to echo its forms, to bring the human world into harmony with the natural and the divine. The Maya built cities that breathed with the forest. They aligned their temples with solstices and equinoxes, with the risings of stars and the pathways of planets. They oriented their lives to cycles far larger than themselves. And perhaps this is why, even after the collapse, their worldview continued to guide their descendants. When you understand time as cyclical, when you see the world as a series of recurring patterns, birth, growth, decline, renewal or collapse is not an ending, it is a turning. As centuries passed, the abandoned cities became places not of loss, but of memory and meaning. Local Maya communities visited them as sacred spaces, honoring ancestors whose names had long been forgotten, but whose presence was felt in the stones. Even today, many Maya people view archaeological sites not as relics, but as living places, charged with spiritual energy. Archaeologists often quietly step aside when modern Maya priests arrive to perform rituals at the foot of a pyramid or beneath a carved lintel. Incense smoke drifts between the stones, weaving the present with the past. The continuity is quiet but unbroken. And yet, for all this resilience, the Maya world also carries memories of immense change waves of conquest, disease, forced conversion, political upheaval, and economic exploitation. But through each storm, the culture adapted, bending without breaking. The collapse of the ancient cities was not the first challenge the Maya faced, nor would it be the last. And each time, the response was the same: survival through transformation. As modern archaeologists peel back layers of soil and time, they discover not just lost architecture, but lost rhythms of life, fragments of pottery, seeds in ancient hearths, tools worn smooth by hands, long turned to dust. These small artifacts speak of daily routines: grinding maize at dawn, weaving cloth in the shade of a thatched roof, tending to fields during the rainy season, teaching children the stories that explained the constellations. It is in these intimate fragments that we glimpse the real heart of Maya civilization, not in the grand proclamations of kings or the towering pyramids, but in the simple patterns that sustained millions of people for centuries. And then there is the forest itself, gently reclaiming, gently releasing. Every step an archaeologist takes in the jungle is both an act of discovery and one of remembrance. Roots must be untangled from carved stones. Trees that have grown for hundreds of years must be treated with care, because they too were part of the story. The forest is not the enemy of the Maya cities. It is the final chapter of their first life, and the first chapter of their rediscovery. Consider how remarkable it is that these cities, built without metal tools or beasts of burden, still rise above the treetops, that their carvings, made with stone blades and guided by human patience, still carry the likenesses of rulers whose names can once again be spoken aloud thanks to the decipherment of the glyphs, that their astronomical calculations, etched into codices and carved into monuments, still align with the heavens that wheel above the jungle each night. And, as we reflect on the deep past, it is impossible not to be struck by how connected we remain to the Maya in our modern world. Their numerals helped shape mathematical thought. Their agricultural methods, particularly the cultivation of maize, support millions of people today. Their understanding of ecological balance, though imperfect, holds lessons for a world facing environmental strain. Their art and architecture continue to inspire. Their stories, once carved into stone, now flow across books, screens, and exhibitions around the globe. Most of all, their sense of time cyclical, fluid, eternal offers a way of understanding that counters the frantic pace of modern life. The Maya saw the universe not as a linear march toward an ending, but as a series of returns. Every collapse carried the seed of renewal. Every loss contained the possibility of transformation. And perhaps, in this gentle worldview, there is comfort for us as well. Because the Maya remind us that even when great cities fall, even when systems break and monuments crumble, life continues. The forest returns. New generations learn to thrive in ways their ancestors never imagined. Wisdom passes in whispers from parent to child. Languages survive in quiet valleys. Traditions find new shapes. And beneath everything, the old foundations remain, waiting for someone to brush away the leaves and listen. So as we leave the world of the Maya for the night, imagine once more the jungle breathing round the silent pyramids. Imagine moonlight touching the top of a temple where kings once spoke to the gods. Imagine the soft rustle of leaves as a jaguar slips through the undergrowth, the same way its ancestors did 1,000 years ago. Imagine the quiet pulse of a civilization that never disappeared, simply changed its form. And in that stillness, Allow yourself to feel the enduring presence of a people whose story is not defined by collapse, but by resilience. A people who built mountains from stone and harmonized their lives with the stars. A people who endured droughts, wars, invasions, and upheavals, yet still speak their ancient languages, still honor their ancestors, still walk the land that shaped them. The Maya are not a lost civilization. They are a living testament to endurance, to adaptation, to the quiet strength carried through generations. And their cities in the jungle, half reclaimed by nature, stand not as tombs of a vanished world, but as reminders of the profound and beautiful truth that human cultures, like forests, can grow, fall, and grow again in forms both familiar and entirely new. May that thought accompany you gently into the night, like the distant echo of a wooden flute drifting through the trees, or the soft glow of fireflies rising above ancient stones, timeless, patient, and full of wonder. Sleep well.